All right, class. All right, class. Y'all, welcome back. Welcome back. Good to see everybody today. If not in person, then at least knowing you're getting to take advantage of this digital opportunity to do a little bit of extra review. So, this is the review for the first semester of the year. You can use this to study for your final exam for the first semester, or if you're heading into the STAR test, you can use this to study for the first semester, units 1 through 5, to prepare you for that STAR test at the end of the year. So, to start off, let's talk about Alexis de Tocqueville and his five core values. Now, the nice thing is you'll never have to spell this man's name out loud, but you will have to remember this man came to America and noticed that American citizens are just different than normal citizens that he had engaged with in Europe. He noticed that there are values that Americans have that just people in other parts of the world seem to not value as much. So he wrote these five core values down. Now, I made you remember them with easy callbacks. First off, egalitarianism. It means equal. The idea that we are equal citizens who have equal protection under the law and equal opportunities. Liberty is our freedoms. When we talk about why people come to this country, a lot of it is the level of freedom or liberty we get to enjoy. Individualism. Well, we're all individuals in this country. We can kind of march to our own drum and head in the direction we so choose. Populism is popular. All I mean by that is we decide to do what's best for the most amount of people. And laissez-faire. Y'all, this is the one I would burn into my brain the most because anytime we talk about the government kind of stepping back, the government allowing people to make their own decisions, especially when the government is hands off with business, when they don't regulate business, when they don't tax business, they're seen as being laissez-faire. Now, remember what I taught you. Sometimes laissez-faire can be great and an excellent thing for our country, and sometimes when the government is too hands off, bad things can occur. The Bill of Rights. Remember, our Constitution is kind of the rule book of the United States. It lays out what rights, freedoms, and rules kind of how our country is going to be operated. Now, when we say the word amendments, what we're saying is changes or additions to the Constitution. And remember, amendments are important because the Constitution needs to be able to change. Now, the first 10 amendments are called our Bill of Rights. They essentially lay out the rights and freedoms that you and I get to enjoy as citizens. I won't go over the entire thing, but if you remember, I almost made up a little dance or hand gestures to go along with each one to help you remember. Speaking of amendments, we get to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. I call it ABC: abolish slavery, become a citizen, can vote. Now, these three amendments are called the abolitionist amendments because this is all about getting rid of or abolishing slavery. When I say abolish slavery, I mean slavery is now illegal in the United States. When I say become a citizen, I mean all the rights that citizens have, now these slaves or former slaves have and can vote. All former slaves that are men can vote with the 15th Amendment. Of course, we're going to learn it's not as easy as all that. And women, we will talk about your right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So 16, 17, 18, and 19. Tax senators who drink with women. Tax, number 16, creates an income tax, meaning every dollar you make in America, the U.S. government gets to take a piece of it. 17 senators. Senators meaning we get to elect our own senators. This gives us more control and power over the government. The two most important are 18 and 19. Drink with women. 18, drink. This is a fun way of remembering that alcohol becomes illegal. And 19, women. Women gain their right to vote with the 19th Amendment. Now remember, when we say the 18th Amendment and banning of alcohol, this is known as prohibition, as an alcohol is prohibited. And this will be the case in the United States of America in the 1920s and early 1930s. They eventually do bring alcohol back with the 21st Amendment. How do I remember that? Well, you used to be able to drink at 18, now you can't drink till you're 21. 18th Amendment made it illegal, the 21st Amendment brought it back. The 19th Amendment, of course, is women's right to vote, which we call women's suffrage. Women suffered for their right to vote. And anytime we think of women fighting for their right to vote, we, of course, should always remember the famous Susan B. Anthony. Eminent domain. This is a unique tactic by the government in which they can take your property and then pay you for it or compensate you for it later. Now, they have to need your property for some sort of public good, to build a school, to build a park, to pave a road. If they need a part of your property, even the house you live in, for this public use, they can take it from you and then write you a check for it later. E pluribus unum, out of many comes one. Anytime we think about this, I think of standing in front of the United States and saying, we are 50 states, but we are one country. We're all these different people and different ideas and different political viewpoints and different cultures, but we are one United States of America, one country. Now, anytime they bring it up on a test, they'll say something like, many people working together on one goal. Out of many comes one. Our civic responsibility in this country, or our civic duty, is to get out and vote. Y'all, be an informed citizen. When you turn 18, get out and vote. I'll never tell you who to vote for or what to believe in. I'll always tell you to express your own opinion in this country. The Bessemer steel process. Y'all, this is a unique new invention of how to make steel stronger and faster and better than ever before. Now, follow my logic here. Now that we have a stronger metal and steel is now stronger than ever before, we can build these large buildings known as skyscrapers. Y'all, you could not build buildings this tall or even taller, which we eventually will do, without this new advancement in steel and construction. Now, remember, as the buildings get larger and as more people can start fitting in these cities, we start to see what's called urbanization, as in the growing of the urban city in America. Now, another development we begin to have in early United States, what is called the Gilded Age, we have westward expansion. I think you can tell from the name, it means people moving out west. Now, the biggest part of this is going to be the train. Y'all, the railroad is going to eventually connect the East Coast to the West Coast. Now, the one big benefit of the railroad is that it provides resources to distant parts of the country. If you live out in the middle area of this American West, known as the Great Plains, now you can live out here because the train can bring you vital resources. Now, also, we've got to remember that not everything about the train is great. Remember what they did to the buffalo. Now, another problem of the Gilded Age is that, yes, there's a lot of money being made. Yes, there's a lot of new businesses and new inventions. But when you take a look at the life of the employees, the people working in the factories and working in these businesses, they're working long hours. They've got low pay. The conditions are so terrible, people are getting hurt on the job frequently. And of course, you can't mistake this time period without remembering, or you can't think of this time period without remembering child labor. Children as young as 6 and 7 years old sometimes are working in these dangerous factories, bringing home very little money, barely able to help their families survive. Now, workers obviously have a problem with this. They want to fight for better hours. They want to fight for better pay. Y'all, here's what you got to remember. One worker by themselves has no power, but when the employees get together, they can form what's called a union. Y'all, when a union gets together, they can demand their boss changes things. They could demand better pay and better hours and better conditions. And one tool that they can use to get the boss to listen to the workers is called going on strike. They can refuse to work until the boss listens to their demands. Now, one thing I will say, the first time that employees tried to go on strike in America, it didn't work out so well. A lot of times they were pressured back into the factories, into their positions, and even sometimes the government stepped in on the side of the big business owners and forced the workers back to work. Now, speaking of workers, one thing that changes during this time period is we're going to get better at making things than ever before. Y'all, this is Henry Ford's invention known as the assembly line. Essentially, the idea is one station does or performs one task, then the next station performs another task, and then another and another. And as we move down the line, we have a finished product. Y'all, the key to understanding Henry Ford and the assembly line is understanding it makes work faster, and here's the key word, more efficient. Now, as we interact with Native American tribes, we got to remember that the history between the American government and Native Americans is not exactly a pleasant one. We will we will we will force Native Americans onto what are called reservations, often sticking them on kind of undesirable plots of land, telling them this is where they're supposed to be. And then we do the practice of taking Native American children off of the reservation and putting them into American schools. Now, the justification is, hey, we're giving them education. We're helping them become, better American citizens. We're ultimately trying to make them more like us. The number one way we're going to do that is by teaching them English. And if you haven't been screaming the word already out loud, hopefully you remember this is called assimilation. Now, we have this process known as the Great Migration, where African Americans are leaving the South heading to the North. Now, here's what I want to remind you. Life in the South, especially for African American communities, is not great. They're living through what is called the Jim Crow South. These are laws and customs in the South that basically make it very hard to live as prosperous citizens if you're part of the Black community in these states. Now, a lot of the African American community will leave the South and they'll head north or west. The reason, well, there's better job opportunities in these places and less restriction on voting rights. Because even though there's been a 15th Amendment for a long time, a lot of men and women in the Black community can't vote in the South. Now, the Gilded Age is a time period of massive immigration. But there's also people putting their hands up saying, stop, no more immigrants allowed. There are people saying that we want to slow down the number of immigration. Their big fear is that there's too much competition for jobs. There's not enough space in America for all these new people coming in. What we call these people stopping all the immigration into America, we call them nativists. Now, an example of nativism at work would be something like the Chinese Exclusion Act. Y'all, it kind of says it in the name, but nativists are able to pass a law that says we want to pause and stop all new Chinese immigrants into the country. This law takes effect during the Gilded Age. Now we're into what's called the Progressive Era. As we pointed out, the Gilded Age had a lot of problems, but now we're in the time of progress. We're in the time of fixing problems. If you want to know who's trying to fix problems in society, there are many of them, but one of the key figures is a man named Upton Sinclair. He is an example of what is called a muckraker, a person who writes about problems in society. Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle, and because when people read it, they heard about how nasty the food industry, especially meatpacking plants, were, they decided to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act. Now, what I want to make you remember is that people were dying from this food. People were eating contaminated food and spoiled products all the time. And this is seen as a way of kind of making society cleaner and safer and improving or fixing the problems in society. Now, a kind of a setback for fixing problems in society is the Plessy versus Ferguson debate or court case. This court case ends when a man named Homer Plessy is arrested for sitting in the whites only train car, and we get the famous ruling separate but equal. Y'all, this will make segregation or separating people based on the color of their skin and their race the law, not just in the Jim Crow South, but throughout most, if not all, of the United States. Now, two men that are trying to improve and try and protect nature are Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir. They are what we called conservationists. Don't mistake these for environmentalists. Both environmentalists and conservationists want to help fix up the planet, but they do it in two different ways. These conservationists help create the national park system and try and preserve the beautiful landscapes of America. We mentioned Susan B. Anthony before, of course, with women's suffrage or women's right to vote. There are other women who are part of this women's suffrage movement, but often Susan B. is given such great credit. Remember this interesting fact? She fought her whole life for women's right to vote. Unfortunately, she died before women ever got that right. So even though she dedicated her life for women's right to vote, she never got to vote in her own lifetime. And of course, we remember her great legacy is the 19th Amendment. Jane Addams, she's a unique figure of the progressive era. She's all about helping immigrants come to the country. Now, here's the thing, and I mentioned this people are going to come here from all over the world for this land of opportunity, but they often don't know what to do when they get here. So, a lot of them will go to what are called settlement homes. Settlement homes are places where they can get some food, some shelter, and she'll even start providing English classes for immigrants, trying to help ease their process into becoming successful in the United States of America. Again, we remember that immigrants are facing some pretty tough situations. They're living in what are called tenement housing or these tenement apartments. Often, these apartments are so closely stacked together that when one family in one apartment gets a disease, it spreads to the next and to the next and to the next. And before you know it, a whole block can become ill with a disease. Now we move on to American expansion. Y'all, expansionism is this idea that America is getting bigger and larger and more powerful as a superpower in the world. Now, what you also got to understand is that you can hear the word imperialism, which means setting up an empire, which when you see America getting bigger and taking over more territory, it seems kind of like an American empire. Now, one of the big stories happens when we send a boat down to Cuba to watch what is happening between the Spanish Empire and the locals on the island of Cuba. We send the USS Maine down to observe when all of a sudden it explodes in the middle of the night. And we eventually blame Spain for the Maine. Now, even though we find out later this was an accident, at the time, people began to blame the Spanish Empire. The biggest reason? Yellow journalism. The newspapers back home kept saying over and over again, it was Spain, let's go to war with Spain, let's revenge the USS Maine. And it got us all riled up and ready to go to war. Now, not only does the USS Maine explode in 1898, but we also annex the islands of Hawaii. Remember, this is a really convenient place for the United States to have control over because we can use it as a military base where we can park the Navy, but also we can use it as a refueling station for our ships on their way to Asia. Now, even though we go to war with Spain in 1898, it only lasts 5 months. We had an upgraded navy and they didn't. We were able to win this with just a few quick battles because our navy was just so far and superior to theirs. And remember, the famous president Teddy Roosevelt will fight in the Spanish-American War, get famous, and become president later in his career. Now, the big consequence of the Spanish-American War is that our country is going to get a little bit bigger. We take Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. This is when territories are ceded to the United States, and you can see America is getting larger and more powerful. By the way, if you notice over here next to Puerto Rico, there's a little notice about Cuba. Cuba becomes its own independent country, but with a lot of American influence. Think about it. We fight the Spanish-American War, we defeat Spain, Cuba gets to become free and independent, but they kind of remember, hey, this is only because America fought on our side. So we have a lot of influence in that country even still today. This The Panama Canal. Now, remember, this is Teddy Roosevelt's big accomplishment as president. He negotiates the digging and the beginning construction of the Panama Canal. The whole point of this canal is to create a faster trade route. The idea is, in order to travel by water around South America, it would take months and lots of fuel and a lot of time. Now we can cut that trip down more than in half, causing faster trade and a better route to Asia. Now, the start of World War One. We all remember this unbelievable story of the assassination of the Archduke. Remember, he is the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and even though this begins as a war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, it's gonna very quickly become a 4-year-long world war. Now, the green countries are called the Allied powers. They are called that because they're all allies to one another, making deals to fight on each other's side and defend each other's countries. And the countries in the middle, we call the Central Powers. They team up and kind of form this center part of the fight. And that's going to be a really tough thing, especially when you look at Germany in this war. Y'all remember, Germany is kind of sandwiched in the middle and has to fight a two-front war. Now, America, that's the focus we're going to have for World War One. America tried to sit World War One out. America thought it was a bad idea to join this war, so we were practicing isolationism until the sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmerman telegram. Now remember, this Lusitania, this boat, it has American citizens on it. When that boat goes down, it makes us feel as if even though we're trying to stay isolated from this war, our citizens are still dying. Now, the big phrase you got to remember for this is unrestricted submarine warfare. Y'all, the German submarines were patrolling the ocean, and basically Germany said, if you keep sending your boats across the ocean, we don't care that there are American citizens on board, we're going to unrestrictedly sink your boats. This angered the American people. But the final straw is when we find out Germany sent a secret message to Mexico where they plotted to take and recapture the southern states in the United States of America. This was the final straw and brought America into the war. Now, the weapons of World War One are iconic. Of course, we all remember the trench warfare, these defensive positions that soldiers will have to live in, how terrible and awful they were, how you could psychologically be disturbed by the terrible conditions. Speaking of a psychological problem, no man's land. This is the place between the trenches, between the two armies, and it is, you know, the most terrible landscape on earth, and it's so devastating that soldiers that are caught out in this no man's land can often suffer from psychological diseases known as shell shock. Another thing that is terrifying about this war is the poison gas. It's such a terrible weapon that not only will we have to develop gas masks to protect from it, but it gets banned in future wars. And even though barbed wire, we think of, bringing an end to the cattle drives in America, it is actually a defensive weapon in World War II, or sorry, in World War One, and is, just an added terribleness of this whole war. Now, a truly awful part about this war is that we did not agree to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Remember, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points was his idea of how we could end the war and create world peace. Instead, what we get is called the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty is unfair towards Germany. The reason you see the Treaty of Versailles wrapped up around a guy that looks like Hitler is that Hitler is going to use how unfair the Treaty of Versailles is to inspire the people of Germany to want to fight a second world war. So, what I'm telling you is the treaty that ended the First World War is a big cause of why we have a Second World War. Now, the treaty that ended the First World War, Germany had to lose land, shrink their military, pay back a lot of reparations, and take the blame. These all were things that Germans had to think about for more than almost 2 decades before they decided to start a Second World War. Now, another bad part about the Treaty of Versailles is that it created what's called the League of Nations. This idea that we're going to have a league or a group that's going to discuss foreign policy and is going to make it so that we never have to go to war again. The problem is, America didn't want to join the League of Nations, so we refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles. We were afraid joining the League of Nations would just drag our country into future wars. We didn't want that to ever happen again. We wanted to make sure we could remain isolated if we wanted. Now, the 1920s. When we enter the Roaring Twenties, we will talk about a lot of really good and kind of upbeat and inventful things. But one of the negatives of the 1920s is the rise of the KKK. Y'all, they publish a movie or produce a movie called Birth of a Nation, and it inspires millions of people to join the Klan. That means in the Jim Crow South, violence is going to be at an all-time high in the 1920s. Now, they're also going to start using this fake science known as eugenics. They use this science to try and justify their ideas of racism and discrimination. Y'all, there is no scientific evidence that any one group of human beings is superior to any other group of human beings. Now, another part of the 1920s I'll remind you about is that this is a time period of prohibition. And even though alcohol is illegal, people still find a way to go out and drink. They go to these secret clubs called speakeasies. Another eventful part of the 1920s, besides women getting the right to vote, is they're starting to express themselves more socially. They're going out and dancing to jazz music that we get because of the Harlem Renaissance. We start to see them dress the way they want, wear makeup the way they want. This idea of women gaining political rights with the 19th Amendment equals women gaining social rights and kind of changing what it means to be a traditional woman and what roles they play in American society. Now, the 1920s are also where we see the beginning of what's called the Red Scare. We'll see this come back when we get to the Cold War, America versus the Soviet Union. But y'all, our fear of communism goes all the way back to the 1920s. We saw what communism did over to Russia during World War One, and our biggest fear is that communism and the secret communists might make their way to America and take over our country. It starts to make us afraid of anything that's just too close to communism. This also makes us start rounding up certain immigrants, especially from certain parts of Europe, and kicking them out of the country simply because, hey, they might be communist. Now, the 1920s, this party that people thought would never end, all comes crashing down when the stock market comes crashing down on Black Tuesday. Now, here's what I want to remind you. In the 1920s, the stock market kept going up and up and up. And because of that, people thought if I just throw my money in the stock market, I'm going to get rich, no problem. That created what's called over speculation. Too many people in the stock market, too many people investing, too many people taking out loans or buying on margins and then investing in the stock market. And when it all came crashing down, it made the depression that much worse. Now, the first thing that happened was called the run on the banks. People ran to the bank to try and pull their money out. Unfortunately, their money was just gone. Their money just simply disappeared out of the economy, and the banks failed. This caused massive unemployment. People started to lay off, or businesses started to close, and before you know it, the country's getting so desperate they're waiting in bread lines. So many people are going to be living on the streets that we become no, that we start calling these homeless encampments Hoovervilles. The idea is we're blaming President Herbert Hoover for this disaster, and now that we're living in these shack towns, let's just nickname them Hooverville. And as if all of that wasn't bad enough, because of the over farming and the drought that happened in the American Great Plains, we have a giant dust storm called the Dust Bowl. This makes the Great Depression that much more challenging to deal with. Now, the challenge to get us out of the depression, that is when we elect Franklin D. Roosevelt. Y'all, his plan to get us out is called the New Deal. Now, what you got to understand is Franklin D. Roosevelt is going to do things no president has ever done before. He's going to come up with new ideas to try and change how government and people interact. And y'all, we are more involved with the government today than ever before. Now, by the way, FDR tried to pass a lot of laws in the beginning when he was elected president, and he kept getting denied by the Supreme Court. So he threatened to pack the court with extra judges. This was known as court packing. His fear is that he would keep getting people would keep voting no if the Supreme Court stayed the way it was. If he packed the court, they would always say yes to his ideas because they would be judges he appointed. Regardless, FDR changes the United States of America forever. We get especially important Social Security. You are issued a Social Security number very early on in your life when you're born in the United States, and this provides benefits and retirement for elderly. Basically, the idea is you pay into it when you're young. When you're over 65, you cash out, and the government will send you a Social Security check every month. The idea is we don't need people over 65 keeping working and still holding up the jobs. We need those jobs for younger people. Well, if you're old and you don't have a job, how are you going to pay for everything? Well, Social Security is kind of your baseline. This is your retirement. You pay into it when you're young so that when you're old, you can get the benefit. It's not going to make you rich and famous, but it will at least keep you fed and hopefully keep a roof over your head when you're old. And then FDIC. Y'all, this solves the problem of the run on the banks. No longer do we have to be afraid that if a financial crisis happens, that our money is just going to disappear in the banks because our government guarantees our bank deposits. The idea is if you put money in the bank, if you deposit it in the bank and it's insured or FDIC incorporated by the US government, no matter what happens, the bank burns down, the bank goes bankrupt, there's a financial crisis, the US government has guaranteed our money. All right. Good job, everyone. Do your best. Study for, if you're studying for the final exam, study hard for that final exam and then enjoy Christmas break. If you're studying for the STAR test, this is the final hurdle of the year. Be safe, be smart, good luck, and do some studying.